The dusty streets of Copper Creek buzzed with excitement as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the counter of her small general store, watching through the window as a crowd gathered near the town square. Her heart sank as she recognized the familiar scene unfolding before her eyes. "Another auction," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Sarah had been an orphan since she was 12, when cholera took both her parents during the harsh winter of 1847. For the past 8 years, she had worked tirelessly to keep their small store running, selling everything from flour and sugar to horse feed and ammunition. The townspeople respected her determination, but respect didn't pay the mounting debts her father had left behind. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square as he gestured toward a young woman standing on the wooden platform. "Gentlemen, we have here Miss Clara Thompson, age 19, excellent cook and seamstress. Bidding starts at $50. Sarah's stomach churned. She had heard whispers about these bride auctions becoming more common as desperate families sold their daughters to pay off debts, or as young women with nowhere else to turn offered themselves up for marriage to survive the harsh frontier life. The practice made her skin crawl, but she understood the desperation that drove people to such measures. "$60!" shouted a burly man with tobacco stains on his shirt. "$75!" countered another voice from the crowd. Sarah turned away from the window, unable to watch anymore. She busied herself organizing the shelves, trying to block out the sounds from outside. But her concentration was broken when the store's bell chimed, announcing a customer. She looked up to see a tall stranger standing in the doorway. His weathered face spoke of long days under the desert sun, and his clothes, though dusty from travel, were well made. A silver star pinned to his vest caught the light streaming through the window. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat politely. "Name's Jake Morrison. I'm the new sheriff here in Copper Creek." Sarah nodded curtly. "Sarah Mitchell. This is my store. What can I help you with, Sheriff?" Jake's eyes were kind but tired as he glanced toward the window where the auction continued. "I was hoping to get some supplies, but I have to admit, that spectacle out there has me more than a little disturbed. The bride auction?" Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. "It's becoming quite common around these parts. Desperate times, I suppose." "Desperate times don't excuse treating women like cattle," Jake said firmly. "Back where I come from in Colorado, we found better ways to help folks in need." Sarah studied the new sheriff's face, surprised by his words. Most men in town either participated in or simply ignored the auctions. "Well, Sheriff Morrison, you'll find that Copper Creek has its own way of doing things. The mayor and his cronies make sure of that." "Speaking of Mayor Hutchins," Jake said, "I heard he owns quite a bit of property around town, including some debts." Sarah's face darkened. "He owns plenty, all right, including the debt on this store." She gestured around the modest space that had been her home and livelihood for so many years. "My father borrowed money from him to expand the business right before he died. Now Hutchins is calling in the loan." "How much do you owe?" Jake asked gently. $200, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have until the end of the month, or—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice what they both knew would happen. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "Or you'll end up on that auction block yourself." Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "Never. I'll leave town first. I'll go to California or Oregon Territory. Anywhere but that platform." $200 is a lot of money, Jake mused, "but it's not impossible to come by honestly. What kind of business does this store typically do?" "Enough to get by, usually," Sarah explained. "But the railroad survey team that was supposed to come through town got diverted south. We lost a lot of expected income when they didn't show up to buy supplies." From outside, they heard the auctioneer's gavel bang down. "Sold to Mr. Garrett for $110. Jake's jaw tightened. That poor girl. Sarah watched through the window as Clara Thompson was led away by her new husband, a man old enough to be her father. "She's probably better off than she was before," Sarah said quietly. "At least now she'll have food and shelter." "That's no way for anyone to live," Jake replied, "especially not a young woman with her whole life ahead of her." "Pretty words, Sheriff," Sarah said, turning back to face him. "But words don't change reality. This is the frontier, not some fancy eastern city. People do what they have to do to survive." Jake picked up a can of peaches from the counter, examining the label thoughtfully. "I'll take these, and a pound of coffee beans," he said. "And I want you to know something, Miss Mitchell." "What's that?" "I intend to make some changes around here." starting with putting a stop to those auctions. Sarah let out a harsh laugh. Good luck with that, Sheriff. Mayor Hutchins makes money off those auctions. He gets a cut of every sale. And what Mayor Hutchins wants in this town, Mayor Hutchins gets. We'll see about that, Jake said, placing coins on the counter for his purchases. In the meantime, I'd like to help you with your situation, if you'll let me. Sarah's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Help me how? And why would you want to? Because it's the right thing to do, Jake replied simply. And because I've seen what happens to communities when good people get forced out by bad circumstances. I don't need charity, Sheriff Morrison. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. Jake leaned against the counter. This town is going to need supplies for the new folks moving in. The territorial governor is planning to establish a permanent military outpost about 20 miles north of here. That means soldiers, settlers, and steady business. Sarah's eyebrows rose with interest. How do you know all this? Because part of my job is knowing what's coming down the road, Jake explained. The question is, will you still be here to take advantage of it? Before Sarah could respond, the store's bell chimed again. Mayor Hutchins walked in. His round face flushed from the heat and his expensive suit slightly rumpled. He was followed by his ever-present shadow, Bart Coleman, a hired gun who served as the mayor's enforcer. Well, well, Hutchins said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. If it isn't on you, Sheriff, getting acquainted with the local merchants. Mayor Hutchins? Jake nodded politely but coolly. I trust Miss Mitchell here has been filling you in on the local customs, Hutchins continued, his small eyes glittering with malice. Business transaction. Sarah's face flushed with anger and humiliation. We don't have any business to discuss, Mayor. Not in front of others. Oh, but we do, my dear, Hutchins said, pulling out a gold pocket watch and making a show of checking the time. You have exactly 12 days to pay what you owe, or this store goes up for auction, along with everything in it. Including the owner? Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Hutchins turned to face the sheriff, his smile never wavering. That would be Miss Mitchell's choice, of course, though I suspect she'll find the alternatives limited. There are always alternatives, Jake said firmly. Legal alternatives. Of course, Sheriff, Hutchins agreed. Though sometimes the legal alternatives are the most expensive ones. Court fees, lawyer fees, interest on overdue loans, he shrugged. It all adds up quickly. Bart Coleman stepped forward slightly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt.
It was a subtle threat, but everyone in the room understood it perfectly.
Gentlemen, Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the fear she felt inside, I think this conversation is over.
Mayor Hutchins, you'll have your money by the deadline, one way or another. I certainly hope so, my dear, Hutchins replied. It would be such a shame to see a young woman of your qualities reduced to desperate measures. After the mayor and his gunman left, the store fell into tense silence. Jake watched Sarah carefully, noting the way she held herself straight despite the obvious pressure she was under. That man is a snake, Jake said finally. Maybe so, Sarah replied. But he's a snake with legal documents and the sheriff's badge backing him up. It paused, then looked at Jake with surprise. Wait, you are the sheriff now. That's right, Jake confirmed. And I take my oath seriously, to protect and serve all the citizens of this town. That includes you, Miss Mitchell. Pretty words again, Sheriff, Sarah said, but her tone was softer now. What exactly are you proposing? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. I'm proposing that we find a way to keep you in business and keep you off that auction block, legally and honorably. And how do you suggest we do that? By making this store profitable enough to pay off the debt, Jake said. I told you about the military outpost, but there's more. The territorial government is also planning to establish a new mail route through here. That means regular stagecoach service, more travelers, more business. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but she quickly suppressed it. She had learned not to trust in dreams that might not come true. Even if all that happens, it won't be in time to save the store. Maybe not, Jake agreed. But there might be another way.
What kind of way?
Jake took a deep breath. Marriage. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. I told you, Sheriff Morrison, I will never stand on that auction block. I don't care who you are or what kind of badge you wear. Not that kind of marriage, Jake said quickly. A real marriage. A partnership between equals. Sarah stared at him in shock. Are you proposing to me, Sheriff? We just met an hour ago. I'm proposing a solution that benefits both of us, Jake explained. You need money to pay off your debt. I need a place to live and someone who knows this town and its people. A married couple running a business together would have twice the chance of success as either of us trying to make it alone. This is insane, Sarah said, shaking her head. You don't know anything about me. I could be a terrible person. Could be, Jake agreed. But I don't think you are. I think you're a strong, honest woman who's been dealt a bad hand and is trying to make the best of it. Sarah walked to the window and stared out at the town square, where workers were already taking down the auction platform. What would you get out of this arrangement? A partner, Jake said. Someone to help build something lasting in this town. And maybe, if we're both lucky, something more than just a business arrangement. And if we're not lucky, then at least you'll still own your store, and I'll have helped a good person stay independent. Sarah turned back to face him. You're asking me to trust a complete stranger with my entire future. Yes, Jake said simply. I am. Just like I'm trusting you with mine. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting the store in golden light. Sarah looked around at the shelves her father had built, the counter where her mother used to stand, the home that had sheltered her through so many hard times. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, Jake agreed. But remember, we only have 12 days. After Jake left, Sarah sat alone in her store as darkness fell over Copper Creek. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Horses being led to stables, voices calling out goodbyes, the distant sound of a piano playing in the saloon. She thought about her parents, wondering what they would think of her situation. They had always taught her to be independent, to stand on her own 2 feet, but they had also taught her to be practical, to make the choices that would allow her to survive and thrive. As she locked up the store and climbed the narrow stairs to her small living quarters above, Sarah found herself thinking about the new sheriff's proposal. It was crazy, certainly, but it was also the first real hope she had felt in months. The question was, could she trust Jake Morrison? And more importantly, could she trust herself to make such a momentous decision with so little time and information? Outside her window, Copper Creek slept under a blanket of stars, unaware that the fate of one of its most determined residents hung in the balance. 3 days had passed since Sheriff Morrison's unexpected proposal, and Sarah had barely slept. She spent her time serving customers and trying to act normal, but her mind was constantly turning over the impossible decision she faced. Trust a stranger with marriage, or face the auction block in 9 days. On the 4th morning, as she was arranging a display of canned goods, the store bell chimed. Sarah looked up, expecting another customer, but instead found herself face to face with Martha Hendricks, the town's most notorious gossip. Good morning, Sarah dear, Martha said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I hear you've been getting quite friendly with our new sheriff. Sheriff Morrison is a customer, nothing more. Oh, of course, Martha replied, running her fingers along the counter as she spoke, though people are saying he's been spending quite a bit of time here, asking questions about your situation. My situation is my own business, Mrs. Hendricks. Martha's smile grew wider. Not for much longer, I'm afraid. Word around town is that Mayor Hutchins already has buyers lined up for when this place goes to auction. Seems there's quite a bit of interest in a prime location like this. Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped to keep her financial troubles quiet, but in a town the size of Copper Creek, secrets were hard to keep. I'm sure there is. Of course, if you were to find yourself without means of support, Martha continued with false concern, I'm sure arrangements could be made. The mayor is always looking out for the welfare of our young ladies. The implication was clear. Martha was here as Mayor Hutchins' messenger, reminding Sarah of what awaited her if she couldn't pay her debts, the auction block, and a forced marriage to whoever bid highest. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hendricks, Sarah said coldly, but I won't be needing the mayor's help. We'll see, dear, Martha replied, heading toward the door. We'll see. After Martha left, Sarah sank into the chair behind the counter, her hands shaking with anger and fear. The vultures were already circling, waiting for her to fall so they could pick over what remained of her life. That afternoon, Jake Morrison returned to the store. This time, he wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair accompanied him. Miss Mitchell, Jake said, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Delegar, Eleanor Hayes. She runs the boarding house where I'm staying. Pleased to meet you, dear, Mrs. Hayes said warmly. Jake has told me quite a bit about you. Sarah looked between them suspiciously. Has he now? Don't worry, Mrs. Hayes laughed. All good things, I assure you. He's quite impressed with how you've kept this store running on your own. Mrs. Hayes has lived in Copper Creek for 15 years, Jake explained. I thought she might be able to give you some perspective on my character, since you're right to be cautious about trusting a stranger. Sarah appreciated his thoughtfulness, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. And what would you tell me about Sheriff Morrison's character, Mrs. Tatterpard? Hayes? The older woman considered the question seriously. I'd tell you that in the 3 weeks he's been here, he's already done more to help the decent folks in this town than our last sheriff did in 2 years. He stopped a group of drunken cowboys from terrorizing the Chinese laundry family. He made sure old Mr. Peterson got his stolen chickens back instead of just writing it off as a loss. And yesterday, he prevented a fight between 2 homesteaders over water rights by sitting them down and helping them work out a fair agreement. That's all very admirable, Sarah said, but it doesn't tell me what kind of husband he would make. Mrs. Hayes nodded. Fair enough. Let me tell you about the morning I found him in my kitchen at 5 o'clock, making breakfast for all my boarders because he heard me coughing and thought I might be coming down with something. Or the way he tips his hat to every lady he passes on the street, regardless of her social standing. Or how he spent his own money to buy supplies for the widow Thompson when her husband died in that mining accident. Despite herself, Sarah found these details reassuring. But she still had doubts. Why would a man like that want to marry someone he barely knows? Jake spoke up. May I be honest with you, Miss Mitchell? I'd prefer it. I'm 32 years old, Jake said. I've spent the last 10 years moving from town to town, wearing a badge and trying to bring order to places that didn't always want it. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of not having anything to build toward except the next job, the next town, the next group of outlaws to chase down. He paused, looking directly into her eyes. When I saw you standing up to Mayor Hutchins yesterday, refusing to be intimidated despite everything you're facing, I saw someone with the same kind of determination that drives me. Someone who fights for what's right, even when the odds are against them. Pretty words again, Sheriff, Sarah said. But her tone was softer than before. Not just words, Jake replied. I meant what I said about this town having potential. The military outpost is real. The mail route is real. But it's going to take people willing to work hard to make the most of those opportunities. I think we could be good partners in that work. Mrs. Hayes cleared her throat. If I may offer some practical advice, dear, Sarah nodded. In my experience, there are worse foundations for a marriage than mutual respect and shared goals. Many couples who married for love have found themselves with nothing in common once the initial passion fades. But 2 people who genuinely like and respect each other, who want to build something together, well, that's a partnership that can grow into something deeper. And if it doesn't, Sarah asked, then at least you'll have saved your store and your independence, Mrs. Cole. Hayes replied practically, which is more than you'll have if you end up on that auction platform. After they left, Sarah found herself seriously considering the proposal for the first time. She made lists of pros and cons, tried to imagine what her life might be like married to Jake Morrison, and wondered if she was crazy for even thinking about it. That evening, as she was closing up the store, Mayor Hutchins appeared at her door again. This time, he was alone. Good evening, Miss Mitchell, he said, letting himself in without invitation. I trust you're making progress on resolving your financial difficulties. I have 6 days left, Mayor Hutchins, Sarah replied evenly. Plenty of time. Of course, he agreed, but his tone suggested otherwise. I do hope you're not counting on outside help to solve your problems. It would be unfortunate if someone were to make promises they couldn't keep. Sarah understood the threat. Hutchins was warning her not to rely on Jake Morrison's help. My affairs are my own concern. To a point, Hutchins said, moving closer to the counter. But this is a small town, Miss Mitchell. We all have to look out for each other. And sometimes that means protecting innocent people from making decisions they might regret. What are you saying? I'm saying that Sheriff Morrison is new here. He doesn't understand our local customs. He might think he can ride in and change things, but he'd be mistaken. Hutchins' friendly facade was beginning to slip, revealing the calculating man beneath. It would be a shame if his lack of understanding led to complications for everyone involved. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Was Hutchins threatening Jake? Are you threatening the sheriff, Mayor? Not at all, Hutchins replied with an oily smile. I'm simply pointing out that Copper Creek has ways of dealing with people who don't fit in. Our previous sheriff learned that lesson the hard way. Sarah remembered the previous sheriff, a man named Collins who had tried to clean up some of the corruption in town. He had left suddenly one night and rumors said he'd been given a choice: leave town or face trumped-up charges that would have sent him to prison. I see, Sarah said carefully. I'm sure you do. Hutchins replied. You're a smart girl, Sarah. Smart enough to know that fighting against the natural order of things only leads to heartache for everyone involved. After the mayor left, Sarah sat in her store as darkness fell, feeling more trapped than ever. If she married Jake, would she be putting him in danger? Was his offer of partnership worth the risk to his safety? But as she sat there in the growing darkness, Sarah realized something important. She wasn't just afraid for Jake's safety. She was afraid for her own feelings. In the few days she had known him, she had begun to hope for something she had never thought possible: a true partnership with someone who saw her as an equal. The next morning brought unexpected news. Mrs. Hayes arrived at the store early, her face flushed with excitement. Sarah, dear, she called out as she hurried through the door. Have you heard the news?
What news?
The territorial marshal is coming to Copper Creek. He'll be here tomorrow to investigate reports of corruption in local government. Sarah's heart leaped. A federal investigation could change everything. If Mayor Hutchins was found guilty of corruption, he might lose the power to foreclose on her store. But Mrs. Hayes' expression grew serious. There's more, dear. Jake thinks Mayor Hutchins might try to speed up the foreclosure process to avoid having his business dealings scrutinized. He might not wait until your deadline. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway. His face was grim, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. Miss Mitchell, he said formally, I need to speak with you about your situation. There have been some developments. What kind of developments? The kind that mean we might be out of time, Jake replied. I just came from the courthouse. Mayor Hutchins has filed papers claiming you've defaulted on your loan. He's scheduled a foreclosure sale for tomorrow morning. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. But I still have 5 days. Not according to the paperwork he filed, Jake said grimly. He's claiming you missed a payment that was due last week. That's impossible, Sarah said, rushing to the small safe behind the counter where she kept her records. She pulled out a ledger book and flipped through the pages. I haven't missed any payments. Look, here's the record of every payment I've made. Jake studied the ledger carefully. This shows you're current on all payments, but Hutchins has a witness who says you missed the payment due on the 15th. Who? Bart Coleman. Sarah's face flushed with anger. His own hired gun? That's hardly an impartial witness. No, it's not, Jake agreed. But unless we can prove otherwise, the sale will go forward as scheduled. Miss Hayes spoke up. There has to be something we can do, some legal recourse. There is, Jake said quietly, looking directly at Sarah. Marriage. Sarah stared at him. What? If you marry me today, legally your debts become mine. And as your husband, I can challenge the foreclosure on the grounds that proper notice wasn't given. It would buy us time to fight this properly. You'd take on my debts? Sarah asked in amazement. I'd take on everything, Jake replied. The debts, the store, the fight against Hutchins, all of it. Sarah looked around her store, at the life her parents had built and she had tried so hard to preserve. In a few hours, it might all be gone unless she took the biggest leap of faith of her life. There's something else you should know, Jake said gently. If we do this, it has to be real. A marriage of convenience won't hold up in court. We'd have to live as husband and wife, at least publicly. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. I understand, do you? Jake asked seriously. Because once we're married, there's no going back. Not easily, anyway. I'm not the kind of man who takes marriage lightly, even a marriage that starts as a business arrangement. Sarah looked into his steady brown eyes and saw the same determination that had driven her to keep fighting for her store. Maybe Mrs. Hayes was right. Maybe mutual respect and shared goals were enough to build a life on. Sheriff Morrison, she said formally, are you asking me to marry you? I am, Miss Mitchell. Will you accept? Sarah took a deep breath, thinking of everything she was risking and everything she stood to lose if she said no. Yes, she said finally. I'll marry you. The wedding took place that same afternoon in a small church at the edge of town. Hayes had managed to gather a handful of witnesses, including the doctor, the schoolteacher, and several other townspeople who supported Sarah and were suspicious of Mayor Hutchins' sudden rush to foreclose on the store. Sarah wore her mother's best dress, a simple but elegant blue cotton that she had carefully preserved for special occasions. Jake had cleaned up as best he could. Borrowing a proper suit jacket from one of Mrs. Hayes's boarders, they stood before Reverend Thomas, a kind old man who had known Sarah since she was a child. "Do you, Jacob Morrison, take Sarah Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Sarah Mitchell, take Jacob Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, looking into Jake's eyes. She saw kindness there, and determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. "I do," she said quietly. "By the power vested in me by the territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jake leaned down and kissed Sarah gently, a soft brush of lips that was more promise than passion. When they broke apart, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Not the calculating look of a man who had just gained a business partner, but the warm regard of someone who genuinely cared about her welfare. The small congregation applauded, and Mrs. D. Hayes dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Beautiful ceremony," she declared. "Simply beautiful." But even as they signed the marriage certificate, everyone knew the real test was yet to come. Mayor Hutchins would not be pleased by this development, and he still held considerable power in Copper Creek. That evening, Jake moved his few belongings into the small apartment above the store. Sarah had prepared the tiny spare room for him, but the reality of sharing her living space with a virtual stranger was more awkward than she had anticipated. "I can sleep in the store if you'd be more comfortable," Jake offered, seeing her nervousness. "No," Sarah said quickly. "If anyone asks, you're my husband now. Husbands don't sleep in their wives' stores." Jake nodded, understanding. "Sarah, I want you to know that I meant what I said about taking this seriously, but I also want you to feel safe. Nothing will happen between us that you don't want to happen." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude mixed with something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "Thank you, Jake. That means a great deal to me." The next morning brought the confrontation everyone had been expecting. Mayor Hutchins arrived at the store shortly after dawn, accompanied by Bart Coleman and two other men Sarah didn't recognize. "Well, well," Hutchins said as he entered the store. "I hear congratulations are in order. Mrs. Morrison, is it now?" "That's correct," Sarah replied, standing behind the counter with Jake at her side. "How romantic," Hutchins sneered. "A whirlwind courtship indeed. Of course, I'm afraid it doesn't change anything regarding your debt situation." "Actually, it changes everything," Jake said calmly. "As Sarah's husband, I'm contesting your foreclosure action. Proper notice wasn't given, and the claim default is fraudulent." Hutchins' face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff." "It's also a true one," Jake replied. "Sarah's records show she's current on all payments. Your witness is your own employee, which any honest judge would consider suspect." "We'll see what the judge thinks," Hutchins said. "Assuming, of course, that you're still around to contest anything by the time this matter comes to court." The threat was clear. "Is that a threat against a federal law officer, Mayor?" "Not at all," Hutchins replied smoothly. "I'm simply observing that frontier life can be dangerous. Accidents happen. Good men sometimes find themselves in situations they can't handle." After Hutchins and his men left, Jake began preparing for what he knew would be a fight on multiple fronts. He sent telegrams to the territorial marshal and the federal judge in the nearest circuit court, formally documenting the threatened foreclosure and requesting an investigation into Mayor Hutchins' business practices. Meanwhile, Sarah threw herself into running the store with renewed determination. If she was going to fight for her independence, she wanted to prove that the business was worth fighting for. She reorganized the inventory, negotiated better prices with suppliers, and began planning for the increased trade that Jake had promised would come with the military outpost. 3 days after their wedding, the territorial marshal arrived in Copper Creek. Marshal William Bradford was a tall, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He set up temporary headquarters in Mrs. Hayes's boarding house and began interviewing townspeople about Mayor Hutchins' administration. The investigation revealed a pattern of corruption that went far beyond Sarah's situation. Hutchins had been manipulating property auctions, taking kickbacks from businesses seeking licenses, and using his position to acquire valuable land at below-market prices. Most damning of all, he had been skimming money from territorial taxes that should have been sent to the capital. But Hutchins wasn't going down without a fight. On the fourth night after Marshal Bradford's arrival, Jake was making his evening rounds when he was ambushed by 3 masked men in the alley behind the saloon. He managed to wound one of his attackers and drive them off, but not before taking a knife to the shoulder. Sarah was terrified when Jake stumbled into the store, bleeding and pale. As she cleaned and bandaged his wound, she realized something had changed between them. The fear she felt at the thought of losing him wasn't the fear of losing a business partner. It was something much deeper and more personal. "You could have been killed," she whispered as she tied off the bandage. "But I wasn't," Jake replied, wincing as he moved his arm. "And now we know Hutchins is desperate enough to try and murder." "This is my fault," Sarah said, tears in her eyes.
If you hadn't married me, you wouldn't be in danger.
Jake reached out with his good arm and gently touched her face. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his. "I didn't marry you just to save your store," he said quietly. "I married you because I wanted to, because in the few days I've known you, I've come to care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone." Sarah's breath caught. "Jake, I know this isn't how you planned your life," he continued. "And I know you didn't marry me for love, but I want you to know that if something happens to me, it won't be your fault. It'll be because I chose to fight for something I believe in, something I believe we can build together." Before Sarah could respond, they heard horses approaching the store at high speed. Jake immediately reached for his gun, but relaxed when he recognized Marshal Bradford's voice calling out, "Sheriff Morrison!" "Mrs. Morrison! Are you all right in there?" Jake opened the door to find the marshal with 6 federal deputies. "We heard about the attack," Bradford explained. "I've placed Mayor Hutchins under arrest for conspiracy, tax evasion, and now attempted murder." "What about his men?" Jake asked. "Coleman and the others have fled town," Bradford replied. "But we'll catch them. In the meantime, I have some good news for you folks. The federal judge has voided the foreclosure action against your store. The debt is ruled fraudulent, based on evidence we found in Hutchins' office." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "You mean the store is safe?" "Completely safe," Bradford confirmed. "In fact, based on what we've discovered about Hutchins' illegal activities, you'll likely receive compensation for the harassment and threats you've endured." Over the next few weeks, life in Copper Creek began to return to normal. A new mayor was elected, one who was committed to honest government and fair dealing. The military outpost construction began on schedule, bringing new business to the town just as Jake had predicted. The store's profits doubled within a month. But the most significant change was in Sarah and Jake's relationship. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was growing into something neither of them had expected: genuine love and partnership. One evening, as they were closing the store together, Sarah found the courage to address what had been growing between them. "Jake," she said as they counted the day's receipts, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "When you first proposed this marriage, I thought you were either crazy or desperate," she said with a small smile. "I never imagined it could become something real." Jake set down the money he was counting and looked at her seriously. "And now?" "Now I realize that maybe crazy and desperate weren't such bad things to be," Sarah replied, "because they led us to something I never thought I'd have. A real partnership with someone who sees me as an equal." Jake stood and moved around the counter to where she was sitting. "Sarah, I need you to know something too." "What?" "That day I walked into your store, I wasn't just looking for supplies. I was looking for a reason to stay in this town instead of moving on to the next job." He reached out and took her hands in his. "I found that reason in you. Even though I was stubborn and suspicious and probably not very welcoming." Jake laughed. "Especially because of those things, I needed someone strong enough to be a real partner, not just a pretty face to come home to." Sarah stood and moved closer to him. So what happens now?" "Now we build the life we both want," Jake said, wrapping his arms around her. "Together."
As real partners? As real partners, he confirmed.
"In business, in life, in everything." When Jake kissed her this time, it wasn't the tentative brush of lips from their wedding day. It was the kiss of a man claiming his wife and of a woman who was finally ready to be claimed. Months later, as Sarah stood in their expanded store, now the largest and most successful general store in 3 counties, she thought about how much her life had changed. The scared, desperate young woman who had faced the auction block was gone, replaced by a confident businesswoman who was an equal partner in every sense of the word. Jake had kept every promise he had made. The military outpost had brought steady business. The mail route had increased traffic through town. And their marriage had grown from mutual respect into deep, abiding love. They had faced down corruption, survived assassination attempts, and built something lasting together. When people asked Sarah about her unusual courtship and marriage, she would smile and say, "He didn't buy me, he chose me. And I chose him right back." Because that, she had learned, made all the difference in the world. The store's bell chimed, announcing another customer, and Sarah looked up from her ledger to see a young woman enter nervously. She was thin, poorly dressed, and had the desperate look Sarah remembered all too well. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked kindly. I heard you might be hiring," the girl said hesitantly. "I'm Mary Carson. I just arrived from back east, and I need work." Sarah studied the girl's face, seeing her own younger self reflected there. "Do you have experience in a general store?" "Some," Mary replied, "but I'm willing to learn anything. I need a chance." Sarah smiled, remembering another young woman who had once needed a chance. "Well then, let's see what we can do." "Jake!" she called to her husband, who was stocking shelves in the back of the store. "Come meet our new employee." As Jake emerged from the back room with a welcoming smile, Sarah realized that the best part of their success wasn't the money or the status. It was the ability to help others the way they had been helped. To give chances to people who needed them and to prove that in the right partnership, anything was possible. Outside, the sun was setting over Copper Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was the same sky Sarah had seen on that desperate day when she first met Jake Morrison, but everything else had changed. She was no longer afraid of the future because she wasn't facing it alone. She had found her equal, her partner, her match, and together they had built something that would last long after the last sunset faded from the western sky.